So week one, we're going to go through some of the common experiences that people have within the context of ADHD. ADHD is not a very well understood diagnosis or construct from the public perspective. And we'll talk about how that kind of public perception that people have of ADHD can impact the way that people see it, the way that people react to it if they find out that we had ADHD and so on, and how that reaction that they might have would impact the way that we see ourselves within that context. So today we'll specifically go through what ADHD is, what the different components are, how the different presentations, as in inattentive predominantly, hyperactive predominantly, or combined, how they differ, or what similarities they have and things like that. We'll also be then talking about how to command your attention. And over the different weeks, we're going to be getting into different aspects of this. So week 2, next week, we'll be going through a bunch of specific strategies that in the moment you can utilize to command your attention where you may not be able to otherwise. And I'll explain situations in which people with ADHD can actually focus better than usual and how that's impacted, what the construct really is of this ADHD thing, and what does the medication do, what does exercise do, what does diet do, all that kind of thing. Be talking through all of that. We'll talk about what and how much to commit, because it's pretty common to either engage in something like people pleasing, trying to do things for people to be valued, generally with the perspective that that's necessary in order to be accepted and valued by people. And there are, of course, other reasons why you might want to take on things in addition to what you already have on your plate. Maybe you've got something on your plate that's important to get done, some admin task or something like that that's not very fun, but maybe it's not urgent right then and there, but you get a notification in your pocket or somebody asks you for something or whatever it is, and that's more urgent, in the sense of time sensitivity. It's not important, though, in the scheme of things to the point that you would regret not having done it. And it's that recognition of, what do I actually have on my plate? That's something we tend not to do too much forward thinking and planning of, like, this is how much I've got, this is how much I can take on, to assess things like motivations we might have for wanting to change the direction of our attention because of unpleasantness. Like if I'm versively putting my attention on something that is uninteresting, like I'm trying to write a letter and it's like pulling teeth or something like that, and then an opportunity comes up to put my attention on something more interesting or entertaining, then I'm going to have an emotional desire to do that, right? I'm going to really want to. And that's when I'm going to be very convincing in a self-deceptive kind of way to tell myself anything that I need to think at that time that is going to convince me that it's okay to shirk my responsibilities at that moment. You probably all had some experiences here and there of just how powerful that self-deception can be at times. In weeks 4 and 5, we'll talk about moving toward and sticking to your goals, as noting that what and how much to commit in week 3, this is a prerequisite so that we can outline the kinds of things that we should make goals and try to pay attention to and how to do that. And then we get into this aspect of sticking to them, of building up these fundamentally practicable goals that are sustainable over time, that lead you to the best likelihood possible of achieving them, getting those small wins, and then lending itself to sustainability over time. There would be a real tendency for us to want to change multiple things in our life. It could be like, want to get fitter, sort out our diet, be better with admin, whatever it is. There are several things there. It would be tempting to try to take on several, to try to go, this is where I am. I'm going to go all the way to here because this is where I want to be. Maybe from the sense even of saying, well, I should be able to do that. Other people can do it. It's unacceptable, therefore, that I shouldn't. So then giving yourself too much. And one of the key crucial points that we talk about in that week to do with what goals to set is to make sure that whatever you set yourself, your guess, your hypothesis is that you will do it. If you have a goal that you have set up for yourself and you're like, I might do it. I might end up doing this. Or you think, the goal is there because you should do it, that kind of aspect. But you can really look at it and be like, well, I could imagine things getting in the way. Then we've got to change the goal. So at least that guess is yes. And then we'll do any kind of modification. And we talk about how to build up these multiple goals that we have. And this is just about doing it one by one, starting off nice and small so that you can get those small wins, prove to yourself that it is possible. And then once something is repeated enough times, an action, a routine, then it becomes the status quo, it becomes a normal. For most people, something like brushing your teeth or showering or something like that in the morning or evening, this is just something that you do. You don't have to think about it, put it on a list and decide that that's something that you do each day. It's the normal part of the day. And then once a new goal has reached that point, that's when it's a good idea to put on a new goal. One of the ways that people will most quickly and readily come unraveled when it comes to setting up their life with new goals and stuff like that is to do too much too fast, to set themselves up not to success but failure. We're going to talk about healthy life, healthy mind. So these are the kind of the baseline performance things that we do, like exercise, diet, any aspect of like mindfulness and things like that, which I'll talk about as ways to improve your self-control, your ability to sustain your attention on tasks that aren't otherwise fascinating or interesting, that kind of thing. And then after we get into a week on anger and impulsiveness, and while it is much more common for people with ADHD to have some issues with externalizing their anger compared with the average person, not every single person with ADHD does have issues with anger. It's just more common than the average populace, but pretty well everybody with ADHD is more impulsive than the average person. That is that there's less application of the brakes and more forward direction compared with others, and may act in accordance with them more quickly. That is, with less time to think about what your response should be. What you often find with people with ADHD as compared with other people who might have struggles with anger, say when it comes up with their family, friends, or what have you, people with ADHD would tend to externalize their anger quickly and then feel guilty and apologize for it later. You generally get people who are like, fundamentally, it's not about impulsiveness, but a lot of rage in the background. They get angry, but the anger is sustained over time. They don't feel guilty about it later and stuff like that. So that's one of the key distinctions between the struggles that people with ADHD may have with anger and the average person. We'll talk about emotional resilience. So not just to do with anger, but looking at the beliefs that we can form about ourselves or the world that are going to impact the way that we interact with it every day. So these are ideas around whether we're going to be successful when we try things, or whether we're, likely to fail or inevitably going to fail, whether we're going to be valued and liked by people or rejected, and what kind of trust should we have in that whole thing. And that depends on these early relationships that we have and whatnot. And I'll talk about how things like unrelenting standards, also called people pleasing and perfectionism, these type of things, that they actually come out of some of these beliefs that can be formed earlier in life. So the Pomodoro technique is a tool to help us focus during these sessions, also when we're doing things independently. On a really fundamental level, the Pomodoro technique is just about using an egg timer or a timer of some sort that you have a limited time. The amount that's usually chosen is about 25 minutes. And the whole idea is you power in and do everything you can to adrenalize your system when you're paying attention for that time, because one of the key aspects of ADHD on a neurochemical level is an underregulation of neurotransmitter called norepinephrine. Norepinephrine, we have access to plenty of it when we're adrenalized, when the stakes are really high. But when we don't have enough access to it, that's when we can flounder. And it's kind of like low norepinephrine, your attention is open to anything in your peripheral, you imagine when there's nothing really important, urgent, crucial that day, and you chill and whatever, and you're willing to stop and smell the flowers. This is somebody with low norepinephrine, and that's not necessarily an unpleasant state to be in, but it's problematic when you want to place your attention on something that is not really stimulating or genuinely interesting in and of itself. And when people have access to norepinephrine, that allows them to narrow their focus, get that kind of tunnel vision with their attention on just that topic at hand. When we adrenalize our system, like we're literally physically acting and stuff like that, to the point that we get an adrenaline response, then that also increases the access we have to norepinephrine. Norepinephrine is just one step further along the chemical process that our body uses to create said neurotransmitter. So if you've got epinephrine or adrenaline, then you can just take that extra step, make norepinephrine or noradrenaline, and then you've got access to the ability to focus, to place your attention on whatever it is. Now, in the context of these slides and doing it, it's just going to be a matter of kind of breaking the sessions into having periods of rest and periods of intentionally talking fast, delivering information at a rapid rate, intermittent with breaks, rather than just having like a big slog of like slow delivery of information. Tends to be easier to pay attention to. Won't necessarily be exactly 25 minutes. I've just kind of figured out a rough amount of slides that won't be any more than 25 minutes. And I'll explain a bit more detail about technique as we go. Very useful technique, potentially. I'll talk about the applications where it is most useful and where other techniques are probably more useful. All right, how ADHD is defined. We'll talk about common experiences and traits for people with ADHD. So classroom criticism, likely experiences early on in life there. The ability to hyperfocus under the right conditions. So hyperfocus in the context of ADHD, this is, people with ADHD tend to have a lower degree of voluntary attention, but if something is genuinely fascinating, putting our attention on that, we just kind of get pulled into it, and then we can potentially do that for a longer period of time. The degree of involuntary attention that somebody with ADHD has on average is higher than the average person. It's the voluntary attention that tends to come up a bit short, that placing it on something that's not genuinely interesting. Hyperfocus is where, because of that high drive of involuntary attention, it's getting so intently focused on some area that's really of interest at that time, to the point of even, losing awareness of time, not wanting to necessarily get up and go to the bathroom, all that kind of thing. And people with ADHD can often do this more intently and for a longer period of time than the average person can. But when it comes to commanding your attention, I'll also talk about how we can potentially harness this aspect of hyperfocus, where in the right situations, we can have some control over what we place that on. Like, probably can't hyperfocus on something like your tax, something that's just not going to be fundamentally interesting. But if it has that characteristic that it would be interesting, or you've hyperfocused on it in the past or something, then it is possible to re-engage your hyperfocus in that area and therefore, get a high level of productivity when you need it. It was what got me through writing these slides, actually. There was a point earlier last year where I was really intently focused and researching everything to do with ADHD after I realized that the diagnosis applied to me. And then a couple months later, I was asked whether I wanted to put this group together and do the slides and everything. And I said yes, but I was already at that time fully intently focusing on other stuff that was of interest. So I had to reshape my focus back into that area, or I wasn't going to get all the slides done. And the way that I ended up doing it in that case was to find, some sort of entertainment-based content, like videos that would get me excited about the idea of it, so that I can use that to kind of pull my interest back into it. In the same vein, I've done this with people with ADHD where, let's say they're doing a PhD or they do whatever it is, some sort of work that they've got to get done. Another way of engaging that hyperfocus, if it's an area which you could be, finding that friend that you know who's really passionate in the area or something like that. It's something on an emotional level that may pull in your interest at that moment. I'll talk about drifting off in conversations, how that appears to us, how it appears to other people, how we can get in trouble for this, how we can circumvent it to an extent. Having your diagnosis undermined because of the poor degree of understanding that society has generally of ADHD at this stage. How ADHD brains differ from the average brain. I talked about it from the neurochemical level. I'll also talk about it in terms of a couple of different locations in the brain where we tend to have less connections, less activity than the average person, and what these areas of the brain relate to in terms of principal abilities. And then I'll talk about developmental delays and accelerations, as we do tend to have a bit of a pro-con situation there. Just briefly put, people with ADHD on average tend to have a delay in the development of the prefrontal cortex, which does tend to catch up, but an acceleration in the motor cortex. So, that's the part of the brain that controls directly what your muscles are doing. That area of the brain tends to develop a little bit faster on average with people with ADHD. I don't know exactly the reason for it. One theoretical idea would be that, certainly on the hyperactive side, people with ADHD tend to be more active, and people who are more active, they're utilizing that area of the brain more, and they may very well develop it faster. That's just an idea, though. Regarding reading, and you gaze your eyes over a particular sentence, and then you realize that you weren't actually paying attention, so that didn't actually get processed and read. And then you go back and you do it again. And I wanted to say, because one, this applies to most people with ADHD, and two, the medication isn't the be all and end all with that. So the important aspect on a behavioral point is that we, as people with ADHD, we require more external stimulation to focus on one thing, to bring all of our attention to one thing. So there's an emergency situation, you've got to deal with 10 things at once. People with ADHD tend to actually deal with those types of situations better than the average person and not feel overwhelmed, right? And that's a really good thing. But when you don't have enough on, then we fill our attention in the background while other things are going on. So if you're reading and that the content that you're reading isn't being processed fast enough that that's engaging your full attention, then you'll think of other things at once, and those other things may very well take your full attention away from that primary task. You forget what you're doing, get distracted, doesn't work out. When people with ADHD train themselves to read faster, it can actually have the effect where that no longer happens. And the reason for it, and when I say train, this is something that you deliberately do. Just if you wanted to get faster at punching or blocking or whatever it is in martial arts, then it'll be like a practice with the intention of getting faster, and then you do. It is something that requires a bit of labor. But it went from, and this was an issue that I had earlier on as somebody with ADHD, didn't know that it was related to ADHD, where I'd find it really hard to focus on the one book. I get distracted. I find myself rereading parts of it. And once I was able to train myself to read faster to the point that my attention window, so to speak, was filled by that book alone, then I wasn't actually getting distracted. And then combined with the fact that I was reading faster than I was before, there were no problems. What often happens for people with ADHD is they start off at some point, usually in school or whatever, they realize that it's difficult to read and pay attention to the whole thing. And then they're like, well, I just tried to read that. I had to read it again. Maybe I'm trying to read too fast. So then they slow down because they're like, well, if I'm trying to over-engage my processing speed, I'm not going to go very well. I've got to slow down. But that actually compounds the problem because they've got less external stimulation then, and then it gets more and more and more. So that's where it's got to be pulled back in the other direction. Other things can even fill your attention window, like engaging, like having something to do with your hands, even like a fidget spinner, where there's some degree of stimulation that comes from that, and it's not something language-based that's likely to distract you from the primary task. It is common for people with ADHD to drift off in conversations for the same reason, a greater than average requirement for external stimulation. And People with ADHD tend to find it harder to focus on somebody who's a slow talker, who, really takes their time to finish and stuff like that. And that's like a really frustrating situation because it's like, please finish so I can, it's paying attention for that whole time. You get the same person, or like maybe a different person, just walking faster or, that kind of thing, tends to be easier to pay attention to.
Yeah.
If you've got something else like a fidget spinner or whatever that's engaging, part of your attention, then it may decrease the amount that you tend to drift off in those conversations. That unfortunately tends to be something that our friends and family and whatnot do realize. One of the really common experiences that people with ADHD have is being told that they're lazy or not trying hard enough and stuff like that, which is actually an inaccurate interpretation of what's going on. But as long as people believe that and they indicate to you that you're failing, and then what often happens is, because we don't have the filter as a kid to be like, oh, why are they saying that? There could be many reasons for which they're saying that. We think, well, there's something wrong with me that they're stating, and we may even identify with the idea, well, I must be lazy because I can't think of a better explanation. Like I said, if the stakes are high enough, right? If there's a gun to your head to do something, you're probably not going to have any trouble focusing on it. Like when the stakes are high enough, when there's somebody who's there and there's enough to pay attention to. Because like if I just have a conversation with somebody in general, it may not be enough to pull my whole attention into that unless it's a really engaging conversation. But when I'm doing therapy, I'm thinking about what's their history, what's my formulation, where are we heading, what are their goals, all that. I'm thinking of this all at the same time and kind of jumping back in my mind and formulating. So there's heaps going on that's keeping me engaged. It's just, and like I said briefly earlier, people with ADHD tend to deal with urgent emergency situations where other people might be overwhelmed and just be like, fuck, this is too much. Because people under normal circumstances with ADHD, where the other person's functioning very well, would be underwhelmed and not able to get adrenalized enough. It's the emergency situation where there's heaps, that you're just like this. That's when people with ADHD tend to go pretty well. So these last couple of slides, this first one is on ADHD in the brain. So I talked about the different aspects of the brain for people with ADHD versus the average person. So there's the neurotransmitters or the neurochemical level, and there's also the brain regions that develop differently. On the neurotransmitter level, norepinephrine and dopamine are the key neurotransmitters that have different regulation when it comes to people with ADHD. So there's less regulation of both of those in general. Although there are times that they will get spiked up, it will usually take a higher response to do so. So norepinephrine is related to priority consolidation. When we're adrenalized, when we have to get something done or the stakes feel really high, we will have really high norepinephrine, as anyone will. And during those times, we'll focus on a task regardless of how interesting it is or anything like that because we have to. This is when we get a big spike in norepinephrine. It's also involved when we make decisions of any sort. So the greater the spike in norepinephrine, relatively speaking, when we make a decision of some sort, the more hooked into that decision we are, and the bigger a spike would take to get us into another decision protocol versus that. And one way to look at that's not necessarily related to decisions, but it shows the kind of breadth of this, is when you see those ambiguous visual problems, whether it could be like, the silhouette of a person that could be spinning one way or the other, and you don't have enough information because it's just a silhouette to see which way they're spinning, but our brain will see it one way or another. We have a spike of norepinephrine at that moment, and the bigger that spike is, the more difficult it is to then see it going the other way. And dopamine, we all hear a lot about that system. This is related to reward, and it's based on either something being better or worse than what we expect. And that can be about our performance or something that's happened to us. And when we get a spike in dopamine, this is related to that kind of intrinsic feeling of reward that we would get. People with ADHD require, all else being equal, the same kind of stimuli will give a lower spike for people with ADHD compared with the average person. And for that reason, the experience of that is like things that otherwise might feel like a big deal to some people without ADHD, that kind of get spurred on by like, yes, I've nailed that. What else can I nail? That's less likely to happen for people with ADHD unless the stakes fall really high so that we can get that boost in dopamine. Now, the brain regions. So the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, up where it's labeled there, is about here. If you're interested in how that's named, it's dorsal as in dorsal fin, so toward the top of the head. The prefrontal cortex in general is from about here forward and not including this flap here, which is the temporal lobe. And lateral is on the outside versus medial, which is on the inside. So on the outside toward the top of the prefrontal cortex, this is what's related to executive function, working memory, and pulling on the brakes, self-control. And this tends to, all else being equal, and it is developable, it tends to develop less, be smaller, take a bit longer to develop, all else being equal, compared with the average person for people with ADHD. The anterior cingulate cortex is about here. And so the cingulate cortex is a region about here, and anterior versus posterior, as in toward the front of that versus toward the back of that. That area tends to be related to when that sparks up, it'll slow down what we're doing, our decision to action protocol, so that when that's active, we could make another decision and it'll give our dorsolateral prefrontal cortex a chance to actually enact and pull on that brake. That, just like the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, will develop a bit slower and be a bit smaller in general without otherwise working on that particular capability. Okay, so the medication effects. So whether we're talking about methylphenidate or Ritalin or dextroamphetamine, these are the two primary stimulant medications that are available in Australia for people with ADHD. These both upregulate and norepinephrine. And for that reason, they can both allow us to focus in a more pronounced way on things that otherwise don't bring in our hyperfocus. And they will allow us to feel a bit more of an intrinsic sense of reward when we're getting smaller scale things done. And for that reason, it can boost us to, have the motivation to keep on getting things done throughout the day, because we'll feel better about it when we do. Okay, so social developmental delay. Now, the brain regions, some of it we've talked about just on that last slide, but I'll move actually. Okay, so the motor cortex actually is accelerated or develops a bit faster or a bit earlier than the average person for people with ADHD. And this is, the motor cortex controls what our body does. When we have the intention to do it, which can come from the rest of the brain, that part of what determines our coordination and exactly what our muscles are actually performing. This could be related, to using it more for people with a mixed presentation or a presentation including a hyperactive side, because they tend to be more active, but that's just a theory. The prefrontal cortex, so that's what's related to the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex that I was just talking about. Now, this will have a delayed development and will mostly catch up by the time we're adults, but will develop differently. Now, part of that and the delayed development is that it's going to affect the way that we socially interact, which can, even though we catch up later, lead to some bullying and some early experiences aren't so great. In terms of social skills, they're impacted. Now, this can relate to some kind of bullying. It doesn't necessarily actually do so, but it depends on how people perceive that. See, like we might have the desire early on to kind of be a class clown if we feel like we're not valued or we feel like we're not able to do well on the academic front, we might get caught into, and this is something we can do even as an adult, get caught into stuff that we're really interested in and kind of talk people's heads off without necessarily realizing quickly enough that they've lost interest or they weren't as interested as we were at that particular thing.